us. So if you are online, when we get to the question and answer portion, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask questions. So this is a voyage into technology, so hopefully this works. So thank you for being guinea pigs for us. My name is Troy Swanson. I am the library department chair. We are doing a series of events this year on a book called Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong, who just got a MacArthur Genius Grant, which is pretty cool. And so we're having great conversations about community and advocacy and accessibility, and we've had many people as part of our community join these conversations, so we're excited to do this today. Today we're talking about neurodiversity, and we're excited to welcome Jason King, who is kind of our Renaissance man, yay, who teaches in math, teaches in geography, kind of teaches whatever he wants, I guess, shows up, knows everything. And Sara Levi, who is now a counselor at Waubonsee Community College. Waubonsee stole her away from us, so congratulations to Waubonsee for that. And Sara is an old friend, and we're very happy to have her back and to offer their thoughts and to guide us through this important conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to our speakers. Thank you both for your time and your expertise. And thanks everyone for being here.
I think I'm actually going to just hold the mic and stand up. Well, it feels really nice to be back here, so thank you. It's like coming home a little bit and bridging my two worlds. Today we're going to be talking about neurodiversity, and the descriptor is context and connection, because there's some information I find really fascinating that gives context to kind of maybe some aspects of neurodiversity and how it works, and then we'll be talking some about how to connect with people who are neurodiverse. I want to make sure that I'm advancing these slides properly. Let's see here, 1 second. What do I click on to, advance the slide? Sorry about that.
How about
And
those
we're
white
back.
socks?
Yeah, all right. So I'm just going to say a few things about myself that are going to loop back around at the end of my portion. So I work in clinical mental health counseling and consultation. Like you said, I'm also a counselor in higher ed, but I'm really into theoretical and applied research on intrapersonal development, how we develop internally as a person, and trauma responses, and all of which has kind of informed how I actually think about neurodiversity to some extent. So here, let's start with this. This is kind of like the opposite of put a finger down, okay? I want you to put a finger up if you can think of a neurodiverse person that you either know or are aware of. And then if you can think of more than one, put another one up for who else you're thinking of. And just kind of keep going and see if you can get all the way to jazz hands and applause hands, or you can stop where you. I'm so pleasantly happy to see that there's lots of hands out here. And if you were somebody who didn't have a finger to put up, well, now you know me. So I have been diagnosed with ADHD inattentive type, which surprises some people because they're like, you don't look like a hyperactive little boy. And I'm like, that's true. But also other people who know me well are like, no, that checks out. So here's a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be giving a little bit of context on diversity in general and how neurodiversity fits within that. Then I'm going to kind of broaden out to look at sensory processing sensitivity, which is a really nice entry point to understanding neurodiversity in general and kind of normalizing it and having a context in which to understand why people are doing what they're doing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about both sides of common neurodiverse traits where there's kind of a strength and a weakness profile that goes together. Then Jason's going to dig into ADHD and autism spectrum, and then we'll have a chance for some questions at the end. All right, so this is the part where folks in Moraine land Waubonsee land can also kind of chime in. And folks in the audience, please speak up and I'll repeat what you say, okay? The question is, what are some categories that we typically think of when we're thinking about diversity and talking about diversity? Be brave and shout some out. Race. Religion. Gender. Language, yes. Or the need to use an interpreter, right? If you have a disability, right? There's more. We could totally keep going, right? Sexual orientation or being part of the LGBTQ+ community, all sorts of things. Thinking just broadly about that, what are some of the advantages of having diversity just in general? Like, just get a couple things going. Differing viewpoints, yes. I'm sorry, I can't see the screen where my Waubonsee people are if they're responding, but there's a chance to have all sorts of widened perspective, right, on like what it means to live in the world, that there's not one specific small slice of what it means to live in the world or experience things. What would be some of the challenges that happen the more diverse your community is or your school is? What are some of the challenges with that? Misunderstandings or conflict is definitely one of them, right? Because then I'm going to kind of slide into that last point there, because who are systems generally designed for? It's kind of, if you think of like a bell curve, and like the majority kind of falls in the middle, whether it's like the largest racial population or whatever it is. And that kind of makes sense, right? This is kind of a majority, and we design systems around a majority or whoever is in power related to the majority. But some of the challenges is that people live on those other sides of the bell curve. And sometimes those experiences on the side are either not well understood or well represented. So I just want you to pause for a second and think about what do you think of when you think of the term neurodiversity? You don't have to say anything out loud, just think about it in your head for a moment. And then we'll kind of talk about some definitions here. So neurodiversity is the idea that there's a wide range of variation neurologically that exists, which is kind of like a little bit of no-duh, right? Like just like there's a wide range of people that exist, there's a wide range of hair color, eye colors, and ways that people are kind of put together within kind of what's a human being. The neurodiversity paradigm is the idea that there's no one type of brain function that's best, right, or ideal, because to some extent it's really dependent on context. A brain that doesn't really work as well or is not well equipped for certain things could be incredibly well equipped for other things, depending on kind of what is organized around. And like other forms of diversity, neurodiversity is subject to power inequalities because neurodiverse people are often kind of on the edge of the bell curve. But it can also be a source of incredible creativity and empowerment when you kind of get a sense of what those things are that you are well wired for and are able to kind of embrace that. And a neurodiversity movement is the idea that we can seek equality and inclusion for everybody around that. So I'm going to do two other terms here. Neurotypical is having a mind or function that falls within kind of the societal standards of what's deemed, typical or common. It's kind of a neutral term. And then on the other side, neurodivergence is a mind that is kind of on, again, the outside of the bell curve, right? It's differing from the norm in terms of it could be sensing, it could be processing, thinking, interpreting, feeling, and neurodiversity is sort of this umbrella term under which you have both neurotypical and neurodivergence. So that kind of is the whole spectrum there. Divergence can happen because of heredity, environment, it be acquired, can be a variety of things. You're going to hear us talk about ADHD and autism spectrum a lot today because that's kind of two more commonly identified forms that people are more familiar with. But it also incorporates a lot of things that we won't spend as much time on today, like learning disabilities and learning differences. P.S. There's a lot of overlap between some of these groups. And then some other differences in the way people process information, specifically sensory processing disorder. This second one, I'm bringing up these last three because they kind of come up again a little bit later. OCD spectrum, which is like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, but when they were like putting together the DSM originally, they were thinking about, should this be a spectrum, almost like the autism spectrum, because there's something under here that might drive a number of different disorders, where there's a commonality. So I want you to just kind of keep that in mind. Tics and Tourette's disorder, and then this last one, synesthesia, which some people are familiar with and some people are not. Synesthesia is like when you have sensory information that is kind of like cross-coded. So like some examples would be, and sometimes creative people or kind of innovative people will have this and use it in different ways. Like musicians might see a color that is associated with certain sounds. And they're literally having that part of their brain firing and triggering off, and it really helps them compose music or create art or bridge things in interesting ways. So it can be any senses that can be kind of cross-coded internally. Since this is Disability Awareness Month, I want to bring up that idea of like what qualifies as a disability or sickness or disorder really is kind of, again, contextually based on that there's symptoms that are interrupting or interfering with somebody's ability to participate, but it could also be very well that their brain or body is doing something which is normal for them. And so it's a disability depending on context. All right, I love this slide because people always get really interested in it. I'm gonna use this slide to introduce the idea of sensory sensitivity. Somebody might look at those blueberries and be like, a blueberry's a blueberry. And another person might be like, oh no, there's big differences between blueberries versus like these wheat thins, same every time, very dependable. I know what I'm getting. So let me use that as this intro to sensory processing sensitivity. So 20% of the population, 20% of the population, that's a lot of people. That's not a small minority, right? 20% of the population has this SPS genetic trait worldwide. There's research on this. That's a sizable minority for whom there's a neurological difference in how they take in and process sensory information. It can impact any of the 5 senses, in addition to an additional sense I'm gonna call interoception, which is kind of like the sense of touch, but from the inside your body. It's how you know if you have to go to the bathroom, if you're hungry. It's how you know what emotion you're feeling, is that there's a physical sensation inside your body that goes with that. It's how people who are really, really empathetic might know what you're feeling, because they're actually feeling that inside their body too. And so sensory processing sensitivity is something that impacts depth of processing. So you actually get kind of more information and your brain churns it and processes it at a kind of deeper level. So you might come to more interesting connections or conclusions, or different connections or conclusions. It also impacts over-arousal though, because imagine if you've got a lot of information coming in, these folks are prone to more of a startle response, or getting overwhelmed, or needing to leave the party because they've hit their capacity, right? Or kind of modulation problems that they're having related to that arousal, or kind of, stimulation reactivity, which leads into emotional reactivity, right? When we get overwhelmed or over-aroused, we might be more cranky, grouchy, tearful, but we also might be more loving or prone to beauty. And they also have greater activation in their brain in terms of sensing subtleties in the environment, or subtleties related to any of that sensory information, including how they're even interpreting their own signals. So one thing that's really cool about these folks is that they are both more responsive to both positive and negative stimuli from the environment. So like a little of support can go a long way with folks, which is awesome. Because this is going to kind of cycle no matter what you do, and you can try to talk someone out of it, but they're just wired for this. There's a genetic factor to it too. As you can see, there's 50% heritability with this trait. So this is a little example I like to give to folks to think about sensory flow and processing, which kind of will then lead us into also understanding other neurodivergence like ADHD or ASD, autism spectrum. So if you look at these pictures, the one on the left, or it's my left, is like somebody holding a glass, trying to fill up a glass from the tap. Someone who is not, overly sensitive, they have the ability to adjust that tap, how much flow is coming in, they can pour out some water, they can kind of keep it at a stable level. But the more sensitive you become, it's like having more and more kind of water that's trying to come into that glass. And it becomes more and more difficult and reactive and responsive. It doesn't take as much to kind of tip it over into something. And so one thing I think is interesting is that they were studying, like, so is sensitivity kind of an all or nothing thing? It's like either you have it or you don't, or how's this work? And surprise, there was kind of a bell curve to this too. They said that, about 30% of the population, they call them dandelions. They're super hardy. They kind of roll with it no matter what you do. They can thrive in any environment. We need these people. I need these people. They're awesome team members. 40%, they call them tulips. We're kind of right in the middle of that bell curve, and are people who can kind of roll with the punches, but they do need certain things in the environment to be able to thrive. And then 30% they called orchids, who, like, if you think of an orchid, like if you kind of don't water it just quite right or have the right temperature, it kind of like wilts, the flowers die. You would never even know it's an orchid. It just kind of doesn't thrive. But with the right conditions, it's pretty spectacular. And 50% of those differences in sensitivity are due to genetic factors, and the other half is environment, including the prenatal environment, which is really interesting because how is our body and our genetics and our brain adapting even as your mom is pregnant? Because if it's 50% heritability, and if she's sensitive, there's a good chance you might be sensitive, and is this baby even becoming overwhelmed prenatally? So you can kind of think of neurodivergence in general as like a protective pattern of response that's within like the developing nervous system to try to gain equilibrium, to try to keep that water at the right level. And certain neural networks are going to be dampened because it would not be productive to you feel for any organism to feel like it's being blasted by the fire hose, right? It's going to shut down. It's not going to work. So that's some of why you'll see neurodevelopmental patterns of like not feeling very much. That's someone who was highly sensitive, and it had to be dampened down so that they can survive and function. You'll also see like really sensitive people. So both those extremes are kind of represented here. And it gives you kind of an internal logic to the nervous system that you can understand, because the body is telling a story of how it's attempting to adapt and manage overall over the course of development. I think this is super fascinating. So there's these genome-wide studies, large-scale studies, 90,000 participants in this study. That's a big sample size, right? And they were doing meta-analysis to look at genetic clusters that underlie some of the biological mechanisms that might be in common between ADHD, ASD, Tourette's, and OCD. And they're very connected. There's, but one person in the family might have one, but not another, right? There's a biological mechanism, kind of regulatory mechanism, which kind of makes sense for how perhaps it's managing some of those inputs. So you can kind of, when I saw this study, I was like, well, this is like my family, hello. With, we got first-degree relatives on the autism spectrum, and then like the people who are kind of like hyper-focused on everything, but all the time, OCD spectrum. And then those of us like me who are kind of like hyper-focused and then not focused at all, and then kind of back. And then the Tourette's piece is like kind of like the nervous system trying to essentially clear its throat when it gets overstimulated. So this is a list of some of the lovely attributes that go with ADHD, which have you ever looked at a list and thought, oh, I don't love that I can identify with some of the things on this list. I'm sure everybody's had something like that before. And so this is kind of the challenge or the downside for like just looking at ADHD. I'm going to give you a chance just to look at that. And sometimes you'll see people who either literally muscle their way through by kind of overacting the more OCD part, which is why they might go under the radar. Or you'll see people who it's just like no matter how hard they try, they just really can't make as many inroads in these areas. One thing that I like thinking about in terms of profiles of strengths and weaknesses is that these are two sides of the same coin. I love this cartoon, which was done by Danny Donovan. When I think about, if you look at that inattentive circle, where it says distracted and dreamer, like for me, I'm either sometimes having a struggle to kind of lock in and focus or get through certain things, but then when I get kind of locked in, then it's really hard to get unlocked out of whatever that is that I'm doing now, because the depth of processing is like going, and it's you can split a hair indefinitely, and it's kind of both wonderful but kind of horrible for other things. And that can show up in all sorts of ways. So that's kind of me. But if you think about other people you may have met with ADHD, these things go together, and you can't kind of have one without the other. So it's about kind of learning to love both parts of that. And I'll just start to wrap up with saying a few other things about me, and then we'll kind of transition. This is something I'll share that like is challenging for me, is time blindness, because it's literally hard to, I can either keep track of time and know how far we are along, or I can be present and focused. But doing both is very difficult. So for students, sometimes we're like, oh my gosh, they know it's at this class starts at the same time every day, what's the big deal? This literally can be an actual challenge, that like it's like people will go into waiting mode and not do anything else because that's the only way to be on time. And that's a hard way to, they're like, well, why didn't you get these other things done? Well, because I was trying to wait and be on time. So that's a little bit of the experience of the two sides. I'm going to share one other piece here about my experience, and then we'll transition and pass over to Jason. Remember at the beginning of the presentation, I was talking about like kind of my interest in research and background in like clinical work. One of the things I'd like to share, because like people are like, I don't know, are there like positives to being neurodiverse, or how does that work? We think of it primarily as like challenges or disability. But one of the ways that I've used my neurodiversity to my advantage is that for years I worked in crisis intervention. Like you don't know where you're going when you show up. There's a lot of variety. This was perfect for me with my ADHD, right? They would call me and all I had to do was show up. I didn't have to keep track of what time it was and show up at the right time. Now I know it's time to go. It was perfect, right? And then I would be like working with those like crisis patients who were suicidal, homicidal, or out of control and struggling. And we could just kind of drop into this space where they're kind of the only thing in front of me, and they could feel that. And another piece of my neurodiversity that I would use within this is synesthesia, which is, like I said, that co-mingling of sensory inputs. So for me, like, there's something that's kind of a tactile interoceptive thing that would happen when I'm working with a client, where it's actually kind of mapping intensities and distances, and has a spatial orientation for me, which is kind of interesting. So when doing all these crisis interventions over the years, like I was able to kind of map the crisis patterns of 2,500 people and look at the patterns in there, which helped me understand like almost like where to place interventions, because it wasn't really about this, it was about this, and you could tell like where the intensity is, almost the same way maybe a deaf person can hear music by how it feels. You know how close you are to it or how far away from something you are. You know if it sounds like a hollow box or a piece of a stump of wood. Like there's qualities to it, and so actually this has been a huge help. And I imagine lots of people who work off intuitive hunches. I bet there's more people who have some of this. It's just not really understood or studied as much. So I've incorporated that into my research, and it's a big, interesting part of what I do. All right, so we're gonna kind of pause as we get ready to shift over to Jason talking more about ADHD and autism specifically. And I'd like you to each take a moment, and if you have a pen and a paper, you can jot this down, but if you don't have one, just kind of make a mental note. And I'd like you to think for a moment about like what are some kind of key words at this point in kind of hearing what we've said that might describe your philosophy for how you might support a neurodiverse person. Or like if you had a little sentence for it, like what would that be? You can either mentally think of it, or if you have a pen and a piece of paper, jot that down. We're gonna loop back and check in on this at the end, so just make a good mental note or jot it down. And then I'm gonna pass this over to Jason to talk more about ADHD and autism.
Hello, Moraine Valley. Hello, Waubonsee too. It's good to see you. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Michelle for being here. She's super awesome. So some features of neurodiversity with ADHD and autism. Everybody's a little bit different. We're all a little bit different, but there are ways in which we sometimes converge. When I was a kid, I was not diagnosed with ADHD as a kid. I was diagnosed as an adult. And one of the reasons is that I probably did pretty good in school. When I was a kid, ADD was what it was called, and the feature of it was that kids would have difficult times staying on focus. But people would say, no, they can stay on focus, no problem. They can play video games all day long. And yeah, for the most part, I could. Certainly, that was no problem at all for me. I can still play video games all day long. When I was a kid, autism meant something more like the movie Rain Man in the 80s. Somebody who was institutionalized, somebody who had a very difficult time just kind of interacting with our world. I like memes, so if you like memes, maybe you're like me. I don't know. Back in the day, autism wasn't defined the same way that it normally is today. A lot of people that were considered quirky back then or in their own heads or something like that today might be considered on the autistic spectrum. To think about this as a disorder, I think, can sometimes be a little bit misleading. What it might be a good idea to think about as far as evolution goes. Humans have been around for about 2 million years. So what I've done is I've put 200, don't count them, I think I did 200 different ones. Each one of these ones stands for 10,000 years of humans existing on planet Earth, where they were, I assume, just on planet Earth. For 1,990,000 of those 2 million years, we were hunter-gatherers. So for the last 10,000 years, we became agrarianists. So that one red one is how long we've been agrarianists. It turns out that the neurodiverse brain, specifically one developed for ADHD or autism, has some serious advantages in this world for the 99.5% of human existence that we spent doing hunter-gathering stuff. We're impulsive. Yeah, that means, we can change strategy when we need to. We're distractible. Well, we're distractible because we're always looking around. We're impatient, but that's because it's more of a concrete method of thinking about things. We're hyper-focused, and this is really one of the key features of both ADHD and autism is the ability to hyper-focus. Most people can focus, and a lot of people can focus very deeply on something, but hyper-focus is a very different sort of a beast. than that. We're pressured. If you have ever had a student, if you're a teacher, if you've ever had a student that waits till the last minute to do everything, that tends to be a sign of ADHD. Or if you have ever been that student yourself that's waited until the last minute to do everything, maybe that's something going on. This distorted sense of time blindness. There's probably this person that was playing video games, had no idea that 6 hours have gone by, right? None whatsoever. But when you're in that chase, sometimes that's useful, especially for that hunter-gatherer brain that we came from. We all look for contrast, but hunter-gatherers tend to have to do that the most often. And if somebody's hyper-focused, if they're looking specifically for changes in the environment, that can be a serious advantage. Again, more memes. When we think about how much our worlds have changed, I grew up in the pre-internet era, and all of a sudden I have a magic dopamine machine in my pocket that I can look at whenever I want to make myself feel good. This is a pretty big change from, gathering nuts and berries and stuff like this, and my brain is not really built for that. We see an example of time blindness. An example of hyperfocus. When someone that has hyperfocus, they might very well be thinking about the one thing that's giving them the dopamine that they need, that sort of emotional ability to say what they want to do more than anything else. And sometimes finding people that share the same hyperfocus can be really, really difficult. I could talk about World War I all day long. I could talk about international music all day long. I could talk about backpacks all day long. The problem is these can be kind of difficult to find people. The internet helps, though. The internet, you can find people that are as obsessed with all these things as I am. Hooray. Let's contrast these with the farmers. These are what we might call today neurotypical. Let's see some of the things that they're really good at and how ill-suited maybe neurodiverse people are for fitting into this brand new world, this world that we've only spent 0.5% of our collective existence in. So they're organized. If anybody knows me well enough, I don't know, I'm a bad judge of character, but I don't think many people that know me would say that Jason King, he's a really organized person. I don't know. What do you think, Troy? You're very kind. Patient. Neurodiverse people are not often known for the ability to wait long periods for things. I was just reflecting on this when I was sitting right over there. I was fidgeting quite a bit, and that's a big part of who I am as a person. I'm consistent. Am I reliable and dependable? I'm here, I guess. I don't know. But many times these are the people that are better starters than finishers in projects. Neurotypical people tend to be better finishers than starters. They can pace themselves slowly. They can do marathons much easier than maybe the neurodiverse person would. Autism, similarly, is also an important environmental aspect to it. When we think about many of the characteristics, many of the features of people that have been some of the great thinkers, the great believers, the great artists, those that have really shaped our world and changed our destiny, a lot of them have very strong autistic traits. Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Glenn Gould, the famous piano player who played Bach. Many of these different ones have had traits like this. In higher ed, you see a lot of people with a lot of traits of neurodiverse people. Let's talk about the prognosis. And let's talk about one of the reasons that maybe this is really important. All right, got a quiz for you. Didn't know you were going to be quizzed. Sorry. So, the likelihood of someone graduating college that plans on doing that is about 41% for neurotypicals. What do we think this number is for people with a diagnosed case of ADHD? What do we think? 5%, 22%, 41%, 62%? Anybody want to try? 22? 22? Anybody else? Place your bets. Sorry, it's not 22. 5. That's heavy, right? That is insanely low. And this number that I got this study from was from 2009. Maybe things have changed since then, but that is shockingly low. That is catastrophically low, right? And when we think about it, maybe some of the things that'll make sense coming down the road. These are for ADHD. Numbers are often similar for autism. Sometimes the numbers are higher, sometimes they're lower. Autistic people tend to have a higher graduation rate from college. Theirs is about 30%, but most of the other ones are kind of similar. These are heavy, right? These are similar to many serious illnesses, to many serious diseases. These are numbers that I don't think anybody would ever say, yeah, give me a side of that, right? Nobody would say this. I think about that Charles Dickens movie, A Christmas Story. Like, I think he's like, are these the spirits of things that will be or that might be? And these are not things that are inherent to them as people. These are things that are about the society that they're growing up in. Our society is built around the neurotypical mind. These are ones that neurodiverse people sometimes have a very difficult time being able to work through. When it comes to ADHD and autism, there's a lot of overlap between them. And there are some researchers, some theorists out there that say that they're probably, in fact, the same condition, the same flavoring of the brain. I'm not smart enough to know whether or not that's true. What I can say is that many people nowadays call themselves ADHD, where they have a little bit of autism, a little bit of ADHD. They kind of combine these. Sara talked about a lot of these before. So I'm going to be going through some of the major features of them in general. First one. As a teacher, I've often, before I thought about this and before I realized what was going on, would take a look at students that were doodling, that were fidgeting, that looked like they weren't paying attention, and they totally were paying attention. Many people with neurodiversity stim. When you stim, that's something that you have to do essentially to kind of prod your brain into working right. So for example, I will sometimes reflexively grab my phone, and it looks to you like I'm distracting myself, right? That I'm being distracted. This is my way of paying attention. I find it sometimes much easier to multitask than I can to do one thing at a time. This is because most neurodiverse brains have a lower dopamine than most neurotypical brains do on average. People with ADHD, we know they're essentially walking around almost all the day with low-key depression. The things that drive them out of that are finding their hyperfocuses. These are some of the things that we do. One of the, says my battery is very low. One of the things that's great about being married, for example, is I get a ring that I get to wear, and whenever I get bored, I can just go like that. And just do that over and over again. It's fantastic. Many people with ADHD, they stim a lot, or they have things that they'll do like glossolalia. They'll do things where they focus on different things. It makes them difficult to be around sometimes. People with ADHD, often if you take a look at their friend circles are also neurodiverse. When you take a look at their family members are neurodiverse. Unfortunately, sometimes the worst enemy of neurodiverse people, though, is other neurodiverse people, for reasons that I'll talk about later. What many neurodiverse people have done in the past is they've had to do something called mask. I just realized I'm wearing a mask right now. Not this kind of mask. Masking meaning trying to appear more like a neurotypical person. So this takes effort. This takes difficulty. And for many people that find this difficult, it's exhausting. Some of the things that many teachers do, they think that it energizes people. For people that are neurodiverse, it can be really exhausting to do these things. So, some examples of ways that people mask. We all code switch in life. We all present different faces of who we are to different people. We will all change these things. But people with autism, people with ADHD often have to do these to a much higher level than other people do, and they find it exhausting. And what does this do? In kids, this leads to things like meltdowns or emotional dysregulation. In adults, thankfully, a lot of times, if I'm ever in a situation that I really feel uncomfortable with, I can just leave, but not always. One of the key features, and maybe one of the most difficult features about neurodiversity, is what we call executive dysfunction. There are a lot of things that I know that I should do, and I don't. There are some days at home where it takes me a couple of days to go to the mailbox at home. Why don't I do it? I don't know. I truly don't know. I have guesses. There are some people with ADHD that they find just coming into any sort of routine whatsoever is impossibly difficult. And what they've got to almost do is trick their brain into doing a routine so that they don't realize they're doing a routine. Sometimes when you take a look at the percentage of Americans that don't pay their bills on time, it's really easy to say, why don't they just pay their bills on time? Just do it once a month, then it's done. Or when it comes to listening to people why they don't take their medications. It's just something you got to do once a day, right? Twice a day. And then some of their illnesses would be not cured, but regulated. Why don't people do that? If you've ever said that, you don't understand what executive dysfunction is. I can tell you for me that sometimes when I found that I'm in a period of executive dysfunction, it's because I'm trying to regulate my anxiety. That mailbox, it sounds ridiculous, but what if there's something in there that I'm not ready to deal with? What if there's a letter that I can't accept? Sometimes I think people sometimes feel that way when it comes to the phone. They get a phone call, they don't know who it is, they would rather just put it on voicemail and deal with it later if they do deal with it at all. So these are some things that make it just really difficult to do. People with autism especially have a reputation of sometimes being emotionally cold. There are sometimes, every once in a while, you hear people say, do they even have them? Of course they have emotions. But many of the things that we think of as far as showing respect are things that people with neurodiversity find difficult or impossible to do. Looking in the eyes, for example, that's one of the ways that we typically show someone that I respect you, I'm doing that. For people with neurodiversity, that can be really, really challenging. This is something they can either look at you in the eyes, or they can listen to what you're saying, but it's very difficult to do both at the exact same time. So pick one. One is showing the simulacrum of respect. One is showing the appearance of respect, but not actually respecting you. The other one is listening to what you're talking about. In addition, many neurodiverse people, this tends to be more common with autism, have difficulty understanding what emotional actions look like with people. For the most part, these are pretty universal. There's not too much that is true in humanity that is truly a universal thing. But people that smile, if they're doing so reflexively, are doing so because they're happy. But when people with autism, or sometimes people with ADHD, look at a face like this, they might not see the same emotional reactions that you or I do. This is one reason that oftentimes many people with autism, they have a sense of the other person is disappointed in them far more often. Many people with autism have this sense of guilt that they've often done something wrong, and it can be very, very difficult to handle that for many of them. I'm lucky in that as an adult, if I'm in a situation that I feel deeply uncomfortable with, I can leave, right? I guess even right now I could. Good thing I don't feel uncomfortable, right? As a kid, kids don't have that luxury. Kids are told what to do. They're told this is what you're going to do. And so what happens a lot of times is they have difficulties with that. They'll have outbursts, they'll have meltdowns, they'll have all sorts of things like that. Many of them have something called, that have autism, have something called pathological PDA, pathological demand avoidance, which is where they find it incapable of doing what they're told to do. It's not that they can't, it's not willful defiance the way that, say, maybe ODD is, oppositional defiant disorder. It's more of the case of being absolutely unable to do something. This is one of the reasons that many people with autism, when they're extremely guilty, when they feel like they've got no other recourse, they run away. It's called elopement in the literature. This is something that in adults we often prize. This is something that when we take a look at adults, we say, that's a person that's strong-willed. That's a person that you can't budge them. That's a person that you can count on. In kids, when we try to teach them new things, this can be something that can be very challenging. When I was a kid, well, maybe more like a teenager, I went out to eat with my cousin one time. And we sat down and I ordered a Mountain Dew. Then I drank it. Then I drank another one. Then another one. Free refills are great. Drank another one. I think I was up to like 8 or 9 like glasses of Mountain Dew, and she kind of just looked at me in horror and like, how are you not dead? I'm like, what are you talking about? This is just what I always do. Many people with ADHD find that caffeine and stimulants calm them down. So what was I doing? I was calming myself down by drinking glass after glass of Mountain Dew. This has actually become a problem later on in my life because I'm finding it more difficult to regulate without medication now because, well, when I was 20, I could drink a whole bunch of Mountain Dew with no problems. Now that I'm 47 years old, I drink too many of them and it doesn't sit so well with my body. But yeah, if this is something that you know of or it's something that happens to somebody that you know, caffeine often helps the person with ADHD or the neurodiverse brain calm down. That stimulation, that stimulant has the opposite effect of what it does with most neurotypical people. Another way I can calm myself down is by engaging in my hyperfocus. So hyperfocuses are one of the very few places that neurodiverse people can get a big shot of dopamine very quickly. That's easy to do. You can see how this world is stacked against people like this, though. When you think about gambling addictions, these are something that are often quick fixes for dopamine. And so the people that are often getting hooked, getting addicted to these things are people that are neurodiverse. Many times, people with neurodiversity have auditory processing disorder issues and sensory processing disorder issues. For a long time, I thought I needed to get my hearing checked because if there were 2 people in a room, they were both talking at the same time, I couldn't tell what was going on. And I would say, what? And eventually I just, oh yeah, that's crazy. Even though I totally didn't hear what they were saying, I just gave up. I'm like, whatever they needed to say, hopefully it wasn't that important because I don't want to ask them what for a 12th time in this conversation. What? Many people with autism find it easier to be in an environment that's understandable, that they're comfortable with, that they're familiar with, than ones that are new. Maybe this is one reason that often people that are autistic tend to focus on mechanized things or things that have numbers attached to them. I'm often surprised at how many autistic people are really into Dungeons and Dragons, for example, or science fiction. And I was thinking about this for a little bit, but in D&D you have a character sheet. The characters all have numbers. You know exactly what a character is going to be like based around these numbers. This is a character called Princess Entrapta from She-Ra. If you've never seen it, it is really good. Like, She-Ra was always a better written show than He-Man. It's hard for me to admit that, but it's true. But the new She-Ra is so good. Princess Entrapta was actually written as an autistic character. And at one point she just says this, she's really good at math, not so good at people. Math doesn't change all that much, right? Every once in a while we make a new discovery, we think about it differently. But for the most part, numbers are numbers. People are different. You wake up one day, that person that was really nice to you, all of a sudden is really mean to you. The things that you expected people were going to do, all of a sudden they're very different. This sort of change, this sort of lack of expectations can be really hard for people that are autistic. Sometimes also for people with ADHD. All right, that's my segment. I'm going to hand it back to Sarah. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, that's right. Oh, she's got her microphone. I totally forgot.
That's all right.
Sorry.
What if we both just sit here together and we can kind of transition to the next segment, which is a chance to kind of ask questions or reflect or
Works for me.
yeah. So before Jason shared so eloquently, I had asked folks to just think about like what are some key words, or like what would be a philosophy of like support that you might have for neurodiverse people. And if anybody's brave, though, as Jason just said, the request to go around the room and share is like very anxiety provoking for lots of people, whether they're neurodiverse or not.
I just noticed I'm already playing with my ring again. Like it's just totally, this is a rubber ring too. Rubber rings are so much better than like the metal ones because you can squeeze it, you can roll it around. It is awesome. $7.
I love it.
Sorry.
No. Well, actually, I mean, kind of a good segue. So like, what thoughts do you have about kind of like what it might be like to be supportive to a person who's neurodiverse? What might that look like?
And
Are
I
there
do
any ways
have a
that
microphone
changed?
for people who are.
Oh, perfect.
I can answer my own question.
Yeah. Jason, go ahead.
One of the things that I found is really helpful for me because I am neurodiverse. I'm surrounded by neurodiverse people. A bunch of people around me are neurodiverse. Working in higher ed is chock full of neurodiverse people. If you think about it, that sense of hyper-focus that you need, that really tends to self-select for those. One thing I found is that I have to try to be more certain about my own emotional state before I react. Say, for example, if a kid is neurodiverse and if they just have a much harder time cleaning up after themselves, which is something that many people with both ADHD and autism have, I have to make sure that I'm not taking it personally. I've got to make sure that I'm aware of what they can do, of what challenges they have, and that I'm not becoming too emotional about it. Sometimes it's, as a parent, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I see a big mess and my first thought is not always, okay, I need to be supportive of this. Sometimes my first thought is, we need to get this cleaned right now.
I'm going to jump in and share something that I do to kind of support myself, and I do offer this to students too. Some of them think it's awesome. Some of them think I'm nuts. That's okay. I like that sense of like either the fidget or because like I don't have hyperactivity per se. My brain is hyperactive. My brain is tracking. I don't know what number to put on it. My brain is tracking all the things all the time, which is why it's like, what? Where do I go? Wait, and then I notice this. Now I'm onto this, right? Unless it like settles into something. And so the adding stimulation, the fidgeting, the something that I can do, even though I'm not fidgeting, my brain is going. So I actually have to almost intentionally induce some fidgeting to help myself settle in. And one of the things that I do is I feel very lucky that my dean and my boss is cool with this. Like I have a mini trampoline in my office and I flip it down like a hide-a-bed and I jump on it in between things and it makes me feel immediately like, whew. So like, here I am. And I can totally do what I need to do. And some of that is that extra physical stimulation and release. Some of it is like being able to have some like deep pressure in your joints actually is like super soothing and kind of brings you back down the way a baby, when you put pressure on their joints, swaddle them and or swaddle a baby and they have that pressure and they just kind of melt a little. That for me is something that I use, and I'm really proud and excited that Waubonsee is open to kind of looking at, can we create some spaces to help support neurodiverse students, and just like knowing that some of these like tools or opportunities or things that students may even need either between classes or in classes are actually really important. It looks like.
Thank you both, first of all, for the presentation and everything you shared. So interesting, so helpful, and it's really important for all of us to sit and reflect on it and think about it. And I have reactions, actually, both of you, your comments made me come up with my thoughts. First off is, I think, recognizing our own individuality and everyone else's individuality. And so my first, Jason, when you were talking, I thought it's almost like implementing a pause before you react, before you respond, before you just pause and take a moment and take in, how are you feeling, what's going on with the other person, as you would with anybody, all the time, so that you know kind of how you want to respond in a way that feels kind of natural and organic to what would feel like a good fit to you, and it's not defensive or reactive, and it's also creating a safe, pleasurable atmosphere for the other person. And then with Sarah, what you were saying, I think it's remembering that with the individuality, everyone's going to create and need a space that could be very different depending on where they are that day, that moment, that hour. And so when interacting with individuals, having opportunities for lots of a variety is what I'm saying, not just, oh, well, I have this, because I'm a counselor here on campus, I have this in my office. It's like, well, that might not work for everybody. So I think of variety and always looking for new ways to create variety and, diversity in the ways that you respond to people, I think. So, absolutely.
And we do have a question or comment from Waubonsee, so we'll let them unmute, see if we can hear them. Go ahead.
This is so cool.
Sure, we can hear you. Go ahead. Oh, could you speak a little closer to the microphone? Sorry.
I'm so sorry. Here's the part that I caught, and can you repeat the other part for me? What I heard was about the importance of, like, what it is almost to process being neurodiverse or needing medication, and maybe some of what that experience is. Did I catch that right, or can you add or clarify for me? Yes. Yes, absolutely. Like, let me say this, there's lots of people, like, it's kind of in some ways a luxury to have this is gonna sound like a weird statement. It's a luxury to have a mental health or developmental disorder diagnosed. Why would I say that's a luxury? That seems weird, right? Well, because like you're gonna be who you are, you're gonna have the experience that you're gonna have to a large extent, irregardless of if you have a diagnosis. But not everybody has access to either clinicians who can diagnose. Some of these things can be expensive. They can be difficult to get access to. They might not have an environment or a community that's supportive of that in general. So that process is kind of a whole long wind up unto itself. Like, because maybe I wouldn't even want to have something diagnosed because maybe it feels like it's even harder to kind of accept that. If I just think I'm lazy, I could just try harder versus like feeling like this might actually be something about me that would be far harder to change. And so I really respect that. I appreciate that feedback from our audience member that yes, people have very different feelings about what it means to be diagnosed or even the access to have it and if that would be a preferable thing or not. I think my hope is that we can kind of just, to the extent we can, normalize the broad range of what it looks like to be neurodiverse and what it's like and create kind of an idea of modeling kind of what it is to be the best version of you, whatever that looks like, whatever that means. We need you, and that if people can see more of that, maybe it helps with that processing of, is this me, or should I get diagnosed, or have I been diagnosed?
Hi, I'm sorry I came in a little bit late, so I do apologize if this was discussed, but
The king forgives you.
well, I
this
appreciate
time.
that. Your Majesty, thank you. So, you know, when a neurodiverse or there's also like, you know, the neurotypical population. So now in your, from your experiences or, is there a big difference between the two, or do you think that population is shrinking because is there such a thing as even just being neurotypical? So I kind of struggle with that sometimes, and I'm sorry if this was discussed or not, but are you seeing that gamut like kind of shrinking a little bit compared to this broader term?
That's a good question. Since I talked first, I'll let you go first in case you want to go, but otherwise I'll jump in.
I feel like ultimately a lot of these they're man-made constructions, right? You can't take a look at one person and say that person is neurotypical, that person is neurodiverse. In the past, a lot of times people that were autistic but with high support needs, they were pretty easily determined, but even then, a lot of times they weren't diagnosed as autistic. They were diagnosed in a different way. What we're finding now is that a lot of people that are more in like a transition zone are the ones that are being thought of differently. And a lot of, for my experience, a lot of them, they could do okay in the world, but they'd always feel a little bit out of step. I know for me, for example, when I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was given a pamphlet, I was given a couple of sheets, and I was kind of sent out into the world. I was like, okay, what now? But nothing really changed. It was only later on when I started reading about executive dysfunctioning, when I started reading about auditory processing disorder, things like that, that I was like, I'm not wrong. Like this is still something I want to work on. It's something I want to get better at, but like, I'm not a horrible person because I'm unable to always do the tasks that I need to do. And maybe there's a little bit of a streak of autism in there as well because of the sense of guilt. But I think that ultimately there are a lot of people that are neurodiverse that are more on the cusp, that before they would have been seen as quirky, as different, or as, you know, just kind of like somebody that's kind of like in their own head. And now they're able to find that it's not so much them. They're not trying to be weird. It's more just that they're expressing themselves differently than neurotypical people do.
And I'm going to build on, and this is something that was discussed a little earlier, but you gave me the perfect opportunity to talk about it a little bit more, so thank you. Do you remember when I, in the presentation, I said, you know, 20% of the population worldwide, 20%, 1 in 5, this is not a small group, right, has a sensory processing sensitivity trait. And sensory issues run right through the heart, or sensory differences, or how you process sensory information, how you respond to it, what's going on with it, run right through the heart of a lot of neurodiversity. Like, if you have a problem reading, you're having a problem that has a sensory input, and a connection follow-up problem, right, or a difference. If, you know, so I think about this a lot with that sensory processing sensitivity piece, and that, like, how those things might be interconnected. People can have that sensory processing piece that runs in families, and I think it lowers the bar for all sorts of mental health challenges because you are more easily overwhelmed. I think where you'll see kind of like more like the developmental neurodiversity, like, you know, things that kind of developed in childhood and continue on, is where, like, I think of this on that spectrum of sensitivity. Like, the more sensitive the person is, and if they have that genetic loading, the more likely you will see, like, autism, because, like, it's not adaptive. This person will not survive and be that overwhelmed. Like, other parts of their brain are literally going to offset and not develop in certain ways. But there's like a huge spectrum. And so when I was talking about kind of that piece where it's kind of in the family, like, I mean, I haven't been diagnosed with autism, and I think people would be like, yeah, and you shouldn't be. But on the other hand, I have all these like quirky interests and a first-degree relative on the spectrum, and things where I think it's like you can see subclinical presentations in people where you can see traits. They might not have the full diagnostic criteria, which, like Jason said, is kind of a man-made construction for how we just get our arms around what's going on. But you can see these traits like run within a person or a family, and I think you're right that, like, the more we're aware of this and kind of responding to it, we'll see more of it. But I don't know if that's necessarily a problem. So, like, I think the goal in my mind is, like, can we kind of broaden it out and make space for understanding that, like, we probably will see more of this. And if we can kind of get into that, like, strengths but challenges kind of two sides profile and, like, what we need to do with that, like, I think we as human beings could be in a lot better shape, because there's a lot of things that if we're not wrapped up and overwhelmed by the anxiety of not being able and supported in the right ways, like, people can really flourish.
And we do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
And we're getting close to time, so
Yes.
we might be getting close. This might be the last question. We'll see how we do. This is from
A lifetime supply of Twinkies, revenge on my enemies, and world peace, in that order.
I don't think that fits. Here is the question. Are there any programs in college that are shaped for children or students?
I'm just thinking about STEM in general, like, and the arts. So, like, if I'm going to take a stab here. Like, most people who are in the arts, like, you don't get into the arts unless you have sensory processing sensitivity. Otherwise, like, how are you doing this? Why are you doing this, right? Like, there's something about that draws you. And, like, STEM, like, really is kind of well suited, and you'll see a big clump up in tech and math and sciences sometimes of people who are a little bit more on some of those either clinical or subclinical range of, like, autism. And you almost see, like, little subcultures within that form where it's okay to kind of be this way and it's supported. I think we can do a lot better, though, with this, and I think some of that starts with, if I might be so bold, faculty members seeing a little bit of themselves in this, because guess what? You didn't go to school, get a master's, possibly a PhD, because you don't have special interests. You probably do, compared to, like, other people. So I think kind of getting in touch with that and making space for others, that the people who tend to kind of succeed are the ones who have that, like, a little bit of OCD that kind of drives them and they just keep going. But there's other people here too that we could kind of make the fold bigger and see a little bit more of ourselves in there.
I feel like 10 years ago, nobody was really talking about this that much. It was very, very rare. And today, there's a pretty lot of people talking about this. So this is definitely an emerging thought of inquiry, and I'm glad to be a part of it, and I'm glad we're doing it.
Yeah.
And thank you, Troy, and thank you for the question.
Yes, and thanks for the question. And just to give a shout out, I know there's a lot of great work with our disability services folks on campus
Yes,
making
yes.
accommodations so that there doesn't have to be special separate programs for people, but also I do think it's interesting to think about like, the work that needs to be done and making it more accessible. So yeah. So with that, I think, how about a round of applause for our excellent speakers? Thank you to our friends online for being part of this and for your questions.
Thank you to
I
Michelle,
hope you
too.
can hear, and yes, and thank you,
Yes.
Michelle. And thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, take a look at the resources.
High five. I just realized that, with the mask. But thank you so much, Michelle. Well, thank you. We were talking a lot about, because I'm teaching this class on neurodiversity.